was one of those quiet evenings when the world seemed to slow down. The sky had turned a dull gray, and the rain had begun to fall gently, tapping against the sidewalks and rooftops like a soft, steady drum. The young woman walked briskly through the streets, pulling her coat tighter around her as the cold seeped through. She had always been someone who preferred solitude, finding comfort in the rhythm of her own thoughts and the familiar patterns of her days. Life had not been easy for her. In fact, it had often been lonely. She had grown up without much love, without someone who truly cared to notice her dreams or her fears. Her childhood had been filled with silence where there should have been warmth, and she had learned early on to rely only on herself. That night, as she made her way down a narrow alley she often avoided, a strange sound caught her attention. It was soft at first, almost drowned out by the rain, but then it became clearer. A tiny, desperate cry pierced through the quiet. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. It was faint, fragile, yet unmistakably human. She looked around, her eyes scanning the dimly lit alley, her mind racing with questions. How could anyone be out here in this weather alone and in need? Her steps quickened as she followed the sound. Each cry seemed to pull at her chest, tugging at feelings she had buried long ago. The alley was dark and narrow, lined with old, crumbling buildings. Trash cans spilled over with wet newspapers and broken bottles, and the smell of damp concrete and decay filled the air. And there, in a small corner, partially hidden beneath a torn blanket, she saw it. A tiny baby no more than a few weeks old, curled up and shivering, its cries growing louder as it struggled to stay warm. For a moment, she simply stood there, unable to move, overwhelmed by a flood of emotions she could hardly name. Fear, shock, sorrow, and an odd, fierce sense of protectiveness all collided inside her. She had never imagined herself in a moment like this. The baby's eyes, wide and glistening with tears, met hers, and something inside her shifted. She felt a connection that was immediate and unexplainable. The way the baby's tiny hand reached out almost instinctively, pulled at her heart in a way she had never experienced. She knelt down slowly, careful not to startle the little one. Her hands trembled as she wrapped the baby gently in her coat, shielding it from the rain. The cries softened slightly as warmth began to replace the cold, and the baby's tiny body pressed against her chest, seeking comfort. In that moment, the young woman felt an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. A mix of fear, awe, and something deeper, something that felt like love, even though she had never truly known it before. As she held the baby, memories she had long tried to forget began to surface. She remembered nights of crying alone, waiting for someone who never came. She remembered the emptiness of her home, the coldness of a mother who never hugged her, never reassured her, never whispered that everything would be okay. And now here she was, holding this fragile, helpless life in her arms, feeling a fierce need to protect it at all costs. It was as if fate had placed this tiny being into her care, and in return, it was giving her a chance to heal parts of herself she had long ignored. The streets were quiet except for the rain, but the young woman knew she had to act quickly. She wrapped the baby tighter and checked its tiny body for any signs of injury or illness. The baby was wet and shivering, but thankfully it seemed otherwise unharmed. Still, she knew she could not leave it there. She looked around for anyone who might help, but the alley was empty. There was no one in sight, no sign of where the baby had come from. The thought of taking it to the police crossed her mind, but she feared what might happen if the baby ended up in a system that could separate them, that could place it in a world of strangers when it needed care and love most. Her mind raced as she considered her options. She could not leave the baby alone, not for even a second. The city around her seemed vast and indifferent, but she refused to let it dictate the baby's fate. She decided to take it to the nearest hospital, hoping that someone there could help. Every step she took was cautious, her eyes constantly scanning the streets, her ears alert for any unusual sound. She clutched the baby to her chest, feeling its heartbeat against hers, and drew strength from the fragile life she was now responsible for. The walk to the hospital was long, each block feeling heavier than the last. The rain continued to fall, soaking her hair and clothes, but she hardly noticed. All her attention was on the baby, who had now grown quiet, exhausted from crying. Its tiny body rested against her, and she whispered softly, hoping the sound of her voice would soothe it. She found herself speaking words she had never spoken to anyone before, words of comfort, of hope, of promise. "I'm here," she whispered. "You're safe now. I won't let anything happen to you." The words felt strange and powerful at the same time. a mix of reassurance for the baby and a promise she was making to herself. When she finally reached the hospital, she was met with the usual bustle of nurses and patients. She hurried to the reception, soaked and trembling, and explained the situation as best as she could. The staff quickly took the baby, checking for signs of illness or injury, and she waited anxiously, her heart pounding. Every second felt like an eternity. She paced back and forth, wringing her hands, unable to shake the image of the baby's wide, trusting eyes from her mind. After what felt like hours but was only a few minutes, a nurse returned, carrying the baby wrapped in a warm, clean blanket. The baby's tiny face was peaceful now, its breathing steady. Relief washed over her, but so did an unexpected wave of emotion. She realized that she could not just walk away. She had come here to help, but she had found something she did not know she was searching for. A chance to give love, to care, to be a part of someone else's life in a way she had never experienced before. As she held the baby again, she felt a mixture of fear and determination. She had never been responsible for anyone else's life in this way. She had never known the weight of someone's dependency on her, or the depth of attachment that could grow between two lives so quickly. But even as doubts and fears crowded her mind, she knew one thing for certain. She could not abandon this child. She could not leave it to face the world alone, not when she had the power to offer safety, warmth, and love. The rain had stopped by the time she stepped out of the hospital, and the city seemed calmer, quieter, almost as if it were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. She walked home slowly, careful not to jostle the baby, her mind filled with questions about the future. How would she care for it? How could she provide for it? What would people think? But beneath the questions there was a quiet, steady resolve. She would find a way. She had to. That night, as she sat in her small apartment, the baby finally asleep in her arms, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. She looked down at the tiny face, so peaceful and innocent, and felt a sense of wonder she had never known. In this fragile little life, she saw not only the responsibility and challenge ahead, but also hope, healing, and the possibility of love. She realized that in saving this baby, she might also be saving herself. She had grown up without a mother, without the warmth and guidance that should have been her right. She had known loneliness, longing, and the ache of feeling unseen. But now, holding this child, she felt something she had never thought possible. A deep, fierce love that demanded care, patience, and courage. And even though the path ahead was uncertain, even though fear and doubt would visit her often, she knew that she would face it all for this tiny life, because it had become a part of her, and she had become a part of it. That first night was long and exhausting, filled with feedings, rocking, and whispered reassurances. She discovered the weight of responsibility, the joy of closeness, and the small miracles of connection. Each tiny movement, each sigh and blink felt profound and sacred. She understood then that motherhood was not just about giving birth, but about presence, care, and unwavering love. And even though she had never been mothered herself, she would become the mother this baby needed, and in doing so, she would discover a strength and tenderness within herself she had never known. The night stretched on, and as dawn approached, the young woman finally rested, holding the baby close. She closed her eyes with a sense of purpose, of hope, and of a love that had come unexpectedly but would endure forever. The journey had begun, and though she did not yet know the challenges ahead, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would not let this child face the world alone. She had found the baby, and in finding it, she had found a piece of herself she thought she had lost long ago. The morning light came slowly, spilling through the thin curtains and landing softly on the small apartment. The young woman woke to the sound of quiet coos and tiny movements. The baby, still wrapped in a blanket, stirred gently in her arms. Her heart skipped a beat as she looked down at the fragile little face. Last night had been long, filled with worry and endless questions, but now, seeing the child so peaceful, she felt a quiet determination rising inside her. She knew that her life had changed forever, and there was no turning back. She carefully carried the baby to the small kitchen, making sure each step was slow and careful. The baby fussed slightly, sensing the movement, but her gentle voice soothed it. She prepared a bottle, trying to remember the instructions she had read online about feeding a newborn. Every tiny detail mattered. The temperature of the milk, the angle at which she held the baby, the way she supported the delicate neck. She felt nervous, almost paralyzed by the responsibility, but she also felt a strange sense of confidence. She had always been independent, and now, in a way she had never imagined, she was needed more than ever. As the baby fed quietly, she sat at the small kitchen table, sipping coffee she hardly tasted. Her mind was racing. She had rescued this baby from the streets, yes, but what came next? The hospital had checked the child for injuries, but what about the legal side of things? What about people who might come looking for it? The questions piled up, pressing down on her like a heavy weight. She knew she had to find answers, and fast. She picked up her phone and started calling local authorities. First the police, then Child Protection Services. The voices on the other end were polite but distant. "We understand," one worker said, "but you need to bring the child in so we can assess the situation." She felt a pang of fear. What if they decided the baby should stay somewhere else, somewhere sterile and cold? What if she was told she couldn't care for it? She tried to steady her voice. "I just want the baby to be safe," she said firmly. "I can care for it. I want to care for it. Please help me understand what I need to do." The woman spent the morning on calls, gathering information, and preparing herself mentally for the trip to the hospital. She packed a small bag with blankets, bottles, and clothes, anything that might make the baby more comfortable. Every item she placed carefully into the bag felt like a promise. She would do everything she could to protect this life. Her own life had been a series of survival moments, and now she realized that survival could take on a different meaning, not just for herself, but for someone else entirely. When she arrived at the hospital, she was met with the usual sterile environment, bright lights, and busy staff. She was directed to a small room where the baby could be examined more thoroughly. Nurses and doctors moved efficiently around her, checking vitals, examining tiny limbs, and asking questions she sometimes struggled to answer. They asked where the baby had come from, if she was related, if she knew anything about the child's family. She shook her head. She didn't know. She couldn't know. But she explained everything she could. How she had heard the cries, how she had found the baby in the alley, and how she had brought it here immediately. While the doctors worked, she sat beside the crib, watching every small movement, every blink, every tiny breath. It was exhausting just to sit there, alert to every signal the baby gave. She felt a strange mixture of fear and love, her chest tightening with each tiny sound. For someone who had grown up without care, this level of responsibility was overwhelming but also profoundly healing. She realized that she had never known what it felt like to be needed so completely, to have someone's life depend entirely on her attention, patience, and love. Hours passed. Forms were filled out, tests were run, and the staff assured her that the baby was physically healthy, though it had been exposed to cold and neglect. They explained that the child would need care and protection, and that the authorities would investigate to see if the baby had any relatives who could take responsibility. She listened carefully, nodding, but inside she felt a quiet determination growing. She had no idea what the future held, but she knew one thing. She could not walk away from this child. Not now, not ever. She was told to wait while the hospital contacted social services.
The waiting was almost unbearable.
She held the baby close, murmuring softly, trying to convey the warmth and safety it needed. The baby nuzzled against her, a small sigh escaping as if it understood that it was no longer alone. She thought about her own childhood, the nights she had cried alone, the longing for a hand to hold hers, a voice to tell her it would be okay. Now in this quiet hospital room, she felt a strange sense of redemption. She was here, and she could give this baby what she had never had. When a social worker finally arrived, the woman explained everything again, her voice steady but filled with emotion. The worker listened carefully, nodding, taking notes and asking questions. They discussed temporary care, the possibility of foster arrangements, and the legal steps required to ensure the baby's safety. The young woman agreed to whatever was necessary, but inside she knew she would fight for the baby. She could not imagine letting it go into the hands of strangers, no matter how well-intentioned. The hours turned into evening. She had not eaten, barely moved, barely blinked. The baby had been fed, changed, and cared for, but her mind was consumed by worry and plans. She thought about how she would provide for this child if it were placed in her care. She thought about her small apartment, her limited income, her uncertain future, and yet for the first time in her life she did not feel helpless. She felt determination. She felt courage. She felt love. She realized that love could be stronger than fear, that responsibility could bring strength, that caring for another life could teach her what it truly meant to be alive. By the end of the day, arrangements were being made for her to temporarily care for the baby while the investigation continued. The hospital staff offered advice, supplies, and words of encouragement. Some questioned whether she was ready, but she quietly ignored the doubt. She had never felt more ready for anything in her life. As she left the hospital carrying the baby back to her apartment, the streets were dark, and the rain had returned. But the woman did not mind. She walked carefully, holding the baby close, feeling the small, steady heartbeat against her own. In that rhythm, she found courage, resolve, and an unspoken promise. Back at her apartment, she settled into the small living room, making a makeshift crib with blankets and pillows. The baby explored the new environment with curiosity, and she watched every movement, ready to respond to every need. That night, she learned more about feeding, soothing, and understanding the small signals that the baby sent. Every cry, every hiccup, every yawn was meaningful, and she listened closely, learning the language of love that comes without words. The young woman realized that the days ahead would not be easy. There would be sleepless nights, worries about health, and endless questions about the future. But as she held the baby close, feeling the warmth and trust radiating from such a small body, she understood something fundamental. Life could be harsh, lonely, and unpredictable, but it could also be full of love, purpose, and connection. The baby had come into her life at the exact moment she needed it most. And she had come into the baby's life at the exact moment it needed safety and warmth. As she drifted into a brief, exhausted sleep, the baby nestled against her. She felt a new sense of hope. She had faced fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and yet she had acted. She had chosen care, protection, and love over fear and hesitation. And in doing so, she had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. That first day of struggle, fear, and determination had become a turning point. It was not just the beginning of caring for another life. It was the beginning of a new life for herself as well. She knew that the path ahead would be filled with challenges, decisions, and moments of doubt. But she also knew that she would never abandon the baby, never turn her back, and never let fear dictate her actions. She had been alone for so long, longing for care and love, and now she had a chance to create that love, to give it freely, fully, and unconditionally. And even though the world outside her apartment was cold and unpredictable, inside there was warmth, safety, and a growing bond between two lives that had found each other against all odds. Days passed slowly, yet in a way that felt full and alive. The young woman found herself completely absorbed in the rhythms of caring for the baby. Every morning began with tiny coos and soft stretching. Every day passed with the constant attention that a newborn demanded. At first she had been nervous, worried about every little sound, every sneeze, every small movement. But gradually she began to understand the baby's language, the difference between a cry of hunger, a cry of discomfort, a cry of loneliness. Each discovery brought a new sense of confidence, and with it a deep, quiet joy. She learned to wake before the baby, preparing bottles and blankets so that when the little one stirred, she could meet the need immediately. Some mornings she would sit quietly in the living room, holding the baby close while the city outside bustled with its usual chaos. In those moments the world felt distant, unimportant. All that mattered was the soft weight in her arms, the tiny heartbeat against her chest, the trust in the baby's eyes. She realized that this tiny human had become the center of her world, and she had become the center of its. Feeding times were long and slow at first. She struggled with angles, temperatures, and timing, but she never gave up. When the baby fussed or spat up, she learned patience, soothing it with gentle hums, soft rocking, and whispered words. Nights were harder. The baby often woke every few hours, and she would carry it through the dark apartment, humming lullabies she had never sung before. Some nights exhaustion nearly overwhelmed her, but every time she saw the baby settle into calm sleep, every time she felt the tiny fingers curl around hers, she felt a sense of purpose she had never known. She began to notice little things, small moments that filled her heart, the way the baby's eyes followed her movements, the way its tiny hand would grasp hers when she lifted it, the way it would yawn and stretch after feeding. She learned to anticipate needs, to recognize patterns, and to find comfort in the routine of care. And with each moment, she discovered something about herself as well. She realized that she had always wanted to nurture, to protect, to love someone unconditionally. The opportunity had come unexpectedly, but it had arrived at the perfect time. Even during the simplest moments, the bond grew stronger. Bath time became a special ritual, the warm water splashing softly as she supported the baby's fragile body. She marveled at the delicate features, the tiny toes and fingers, the soft skin that smelled faintly of baby lotion. She laughed quietly when the baby made unexpected noises, a small squeak or a giggle that seemed to erupt from nowhere. Each laugh, each smile, each glance felt like a gift, a reminder that the connection between them was real, powerful, and unbreakable. The young woman's own life began to shift in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her apartment, once quiet and empty, was now alive with soft sounds, with laughter, with life. She rearranged furniture, created a small play area, and stocked the kitchen with baby supplies she had never imagined needing. Every decision she made was influenced by the baby's needs, and yet, she found that she did not mind. The responsibility, once frightening, now gave her life a sense of meaning. She had discovered that caring for someone else could heal the wounds of her own past, that nurturing another life could fill the emptiness she had carried for so long. Friends and neighbors began to notice the changes as well. Some stopped by with gifts, others with questions, and still others with quiet admiration. They saw the dedication in her eyes, the way she held the baby, the patience she displayed even in moments of frustration. Some offered advice, some offered help, but all seemed to sense the bond growing between them. Yet, despite their words, she knew that the connection was something only she could understand fully. It was personal, intimate, and sacred, a relationship built not just on need but on love, trust, and the slow, steady building of a family in the smallest ways. Challenges arose, of course. There were nights when the baby cried for hours, and she could do nothing to soothe it. There were moments when she questioned her abilities, wondering if she was doing something wrong, if she was enough. But each time she reminded herself that love was also about perseverance, about showing up even when tired, about choosing care every single day. Slowly she began to see that motherhood was not perfection. It was presence, consistency, and heart. And in this she discovered her own resilience, her own strength, and a courage she had never thought she possessed. She also began to notice changes within herself. Her fears, once dominating, began to feel smaller. Her loneliness, once a constant ache, was now softened by the baby's presence. She started dreaming about the future, imagining what life could be like for them both, picturing moments of joy, laughter, and comfort. For the first time in years, she felt hope not as a distant concept, but as something tangible, something alive in her apartment and in the soft weight in her arms. Outside the home, she began to interact more with the world. She learned how to take the baby on short walks, discovering ways to keep it warm and safe. People she encountered smiled at the sight, some offering congratulations, others simply acknowledging the small miracle of care in action. The young woman learned to navigate these interactions, balancing caution with openness, protecting the child while letting the world see the bond they shared. Each small outing became a lesson, a moment to grow and a way to strengthen their connection. She also began to reflect deeply on her own childhood. Memories she had tried to bury, lonely nights, harsh words, absence of affection surfaced. But now, instead of feeling sadness, she found clarity. She understood the mistakes of the past, the absence of love she had endured, and she made silent promises to herself and to the baby. She would never let this child feel abandoned, unloved, or unseen. She would be present, nurturing, and steadfast, and in making that promise, she felt a sense of healing. The baby had not only given her purpose but had begun to mend the cracks left by years of neglect. Small milestones became celebrations. The first smile, the first coo that seemed directed at her, the first tiny grasp of her finger. Each moment was a revelation. She celebrated quietly, sometimes laughing softly, sometimes simply holding the baby close and marveling at the miracle of life. Each milestone was a reminder that she was doing something right, that her love and attention mattered, and that the bond they shared was growing stronger with every passing day. Even in moments of frustration, spilled bottles, sleepless nights, and crying fits, she learned patience. She discovered that frustration was natural, that imperfection was part of life, and that love could coexist with difficulty. She learned to take deep breaths, to speak softly, to soothe not only the baby but also herself. And each time she overcame a challenge, she felt stronger, more capable, and more certain that she could handle whatever lay ahead. As the days turned into weeks, the young woman began to imagine the future in new ways. She thought about the child's first steps, first words, and first experiences of the world beyond their small apartment. She wondered about the person the baby would become and how she could help shape a life filled with love, safety, and opportunity. Each thought carried a mixture of hope and responsibility, and she accepted both willingly. She had learned that motherhood was not just about care in the moment, it was about creating a foundation for a lifetime. Through this time, their bond deepened in ways that were almost indescribable. The baby began to recognize her voice, to respond to her touch, to seek comfort in her presence. She noticed subtle changes, how the baby's eyes brightened when she entered the room, how it relaxed when she sang softly, how it seemed to sense her emotions. These small signs reinforced the connection between them, a silent understanding that they belonged together, that each had found what the other needed most. She also noticed changes within herself that extended beyond motherhood. She felt more patient with others, more empathetic, and more willing to face challenges directly. The act of caring for another life reshaped her perspective on the world. She realized that love could be transformative, that responsibility could be empowering, and that connection could heal wounds left open for years. She understood that through this baby, she had discovered a deeper understanding of herself, her past, and her capacity to love. At night, when the baby finally slept, she often sat quietly reflecting on the day. She thought about how far they had come, how much she had learned, and how deeply she had grown attached. She sometimes marveled at the idea that a chance encounter, a cry in the rain, could change everything. The baby had arrived unexpectedly, yet it had brought purpose, joy, and a new sense of life into her world. She realized that life could offer miracles in the smallest, most ordinary moments if one was open enough to see them. And so, the days continued. Each morning brought new discoveries. Each night brought quiet reflection, and every moment in between strengthened the bond they shared. The young woman had found something she had longed for her entire life: connection, purpose, and the chance to love unconditionally. The baby, too, thrived in this care, growing stronger, happier, and more responsive with each passing day. Together, they navigated the challenges and joys of their shared life, discovering that love could be both a gentle teacher and a powerful force. In these weeks, the young woman learned that motherhood was not just about providing food or warmth. It was about presence, consistency, and understanding. It was about showing up every day, even when exhausted, worried, or unsure. And in these moments, she discovered a strength, patience, and tenderness she had never known. The baby had awakened something within her that had always been there, waiting for a chance to grow. The ability to love fully, without reservation, and to give life not just care, but heart. Weeks had passed and life had settled into a rhythm that was both exhausting and comforting. The young woman had grown deeply attached to the baby, learning to read every sigh, every coo, every tiny gesture. Yet, as the bond grew stronger, so did the memories of her own past. Nights spent rocking the baby to sleep often brought thoughts she had long tried to push away: the loneliness, the coldness, the absence of care she had known as a child. These memories arrived quietly, without warning, but they demanded attention and she could no longer ignore them. She remembered the nights when she had cried herself to sleep, waiting for someone to notice her, to hold her, to tell her that she was enough. She remembered the emptiness of a house that should have been filled with love, but where silence and indifference ruled. At first, thinking about it brought anger and pain. Why had she been left alone? Why had no one protected her, guided her, or comforted her? But now, holding this baby, she realized something profound. The past could not be changed, but the future could. She had been given the chance to rewrite the story, not for herself, but for this child. One afternoon, while the baby slept peacefully in a small bassinet, she sat quietly and thought about the woman who had raised her, or rather the woman who had not. The idea of confronting her past had always terrified her, but now, she felt a strange courage stirring within her. She wanted answers not for revenge but for understanding. She wanted to face the wounds of her childhood and make peace with them, so that they would not interfere with the love she was building for the baby. After days of hesitation, she decided to reach out. She called, and soon found herself sitting across from the woman who had given her life but little else. The meeting was tense, filled with unspoken words and careful glances. She noticed the woman's age, the lines on her face, the way her hands trembled slightly as they rested on the table. In that moment, she felt a mixture of sadness and curiosity. This was the person who had failed to nurture her, who had left her longing for warmth and guidance. And yet, she realized she no longer needed her approval. She only needed understanding and perhaps closure. The conversation was difficult. Memories of neglect, harsh words, and absence surfaced quickly, bringing tears and tension. The woman explained reasons, half excuses, half truths, but the young woman listened quietly, absorbing the words without judgment. She realized that holding on to anger would not help the baby, would not help her, and would not heal the wounds she had carried for years. What mattered now was what she could give to this child in her arms, the love, the care, the attention she had been denied. Leaving the meeting, she felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief because she had faced a part of her past she had long avoided, and sorrow because of the emptiness that had shaped so much of her early life. But most importantly, she felt determination. She had learned that she could not change her childhood, but she could change the life of this baby. She could ensure that the child would never feel abandoned, unloved, or invisible. She could provide a foundation of security and trust that she had longed for herself. Back at home, the routine of care resumed, but now it carried a new depth. She noticed the baby's reactions more keenly, the way it smiled when she spoke softly, the way it reached for her hand, the way it relaxed completely when held close. Every interaction became a moment of teaching and learning, of connection and reassurance. She understood that the baby was not just growing physically but emotionally, and that the bond they were building would shape the child's understanding of love, trust, and security. There were challenges, of course. The young woman struggled with the fear of not being enough. She worried constantly about every decision, every choice, and every action, but she also discovered resilience she had never known. She could calm the baby after long bouts of crying, soothe it through discomfort, and respond instinctively to its needs. She learned to trust herself, to listen to her instincts, and to act decisively when the situation demanded it. And in doing so, she realized that motherhood was not about perfection. It was about presence, care, and commitment. She also began to reach out for support in ways she had never done before. She joined small community groups for parents, sought advice from experienced caregivers, and read tirelessly about infant development. Each interaction brought reassurance, tips, and encouragement. And yet she discovered that no book, no group, no advice could replace the bond she was building with the baby. The connection was personal, unique, and deeply rooted in shared experience and trust. One afternoon, while the baby played on a soft mat, reaching for colorful toys, she sat nearby, reflecting on how far they had come. She marveled at the small milestones, the first deliberate grab, the first giggle that seemed to be directed at her, the way the baby began to explore the world with cautious curiosity. She realized that these moments were not just signs of growth for the child, but also markers of her own transformation. She had learned patience, empathy, and unconditional love. She had discovered a strength she had never needed before, and now it was guiding both of their lives. The young woman also began to notice a shift within herself emotionally. Where fear and doubt had once dominated, now hope and determination took their place. She had faced her past, confronted the pain she had carried, and chosen to move forward. She had accepted that her childhood could not be changed, but she could ensure that the baby's life would be different. This realization brought a quiet sense of peace, a steady reassurance that she was on the right path. There were moments of reflection at night when the baby slept beside her. She would look at the soft, peaceful face, marveling at the innocence and trust it carried. She thought about how different life had been for her at that age, and how much she wanted to give this child what she had never received. She promised herself that she would always be there, always listen, always protect. And in making that promise, she felt a sense of purpose unlike anything she had known before. As the weeks turned into months, the bond between them strengthened further. The baby began to recognize her face, respond to her voice, and seek comfort in her presence. She noticed subtle signs, how the baby's eyes brightened when she entered the room, how it calmed when she held it, how it seemed to anticipate her touch. These small gestures were profound, proof that their connection was growing deeper and that the love they shared was mutual. The young woman also began to consider the future more seriously. She thought about what the child would need in terms of stability, care, and security. She made small plans for education, health, and emotional support, determined to provide a life full of opportunity and love. She knew that she could not shield the child from every difficulty, but she could equip it with the confidence, resilience, and trust it would need to navigate life. And she felt a sense of empowerment in knowing that she was capable of doing this. Challenges were still present, of course. There were days when the baby cried inconsolably, when she felt exhausted, when the weight of responsibility seemed almost too heavy. But she discovered that these moments were also opportunities to grow. She learned to breathe through the frustration, to focus on the small victories, and to trust that love and patience could overcome even the most difficult moments. Each day became a lesson, each challenge a chance to strengthen the bond they shared. Through this journey, she also began to understand the power of healing. By providing the baby with love and care, she was also healing herself. The wounds of her own childhood, while still present, no longer dominated her life. She could acknowledge them, learn from them, and move forward. And in nurturing the child, she discovered that she was capable of love in ways she had never imagined. The act of caring for another life became transformative, shaping her into a stronger, more empathetic, and more resilient person. As the sun set one evening, she held the baby close, watching the soft light filter through the window. She felt a sense of gratitude for the journey they had shared, for the bond that had grown, and for the life they were building together. She understood that the past would always be a part of her, but it did not define her. What mattered now was the present, the love she could give, and the future she could create for this child. And in that moment, she realized something profound. Motherhood was not simply about biology, about giving birth, or about doing everything perfectly. It was about showing up day after day with patience, compassion, and unwavering love. It was about choosing care over fear, presence over absence, and love over doubt. And in choosing these things, she had not only transformed the life of the baby, but it also transformed her own life, discovering a depth of love and resilience she had never known existed. The days had started to feel longer but fuller, filled with the quiet rhythms of caring for the baby. Each morning brought the soft coos and tiny stretches that had become part of her life. She had begun to learn the subtle signs, the way a baby's eyes would widen when it was hungry, or the small urgent movements that meant discomfort. She had grown used to the small victories, a successfully soothed cry, a first smile, a relaxed sigh as the baby settled into sleep. Yet beneath this calm routine, memories of her own past began to surface in ways she could not ignore. She remembered the nights when she had cried alone, the coldness of an empty bed, and the absence of comforting voices. The silence of her childhood home had always been loud, echoing with all the things left unsaid. The pain she carried had shaped her in ways she had long tried to forget. And yet, holding this tiny life in her arms, she realized that those experiences, painful as they were, had also prepared her for this moment. She understood what it meant to need love and attention, and to be the one who now could give it freely without reservation. One afternoon, as the baby slept peacefully in a makeshift crib, she found herself thinking about the woman who had raised her, or more accurately, the woman who had not. She had avoided these thoughts for years, afraid of what they might bring up, afraid of the emotions that might overwhelm her. But now, with the baby depending on her for safety and care, she felt a strange courage rising within her. She wanted to face her past, not to blame, not to hurt, but to understand and to close old wounds. With trembling hands, she dialed the number she had kept hidden for so long. Soon she found herself sitting across from the woman who had given her life but little else. The room was quiet, the air heavy with unspoken emotions. She looked at the older woman, noticing the lines on her face, the way her eyes shifted nervously, the hesitation in her hands. In that moment, a mixture of sadness, curiosity, and resolve washed over her. This was the person who had left her longing for warmth and care, who had failed to notice the small child who needed love. The conversation was difficult, filled with pauses, tears, and careful words. Memories long buried began to surface. Harsh words, neglect, coldness, and the absence of guidance. The young woman listened as her mother tried to explain, to justify, to fill the gaps with half-truths. At first, anger and frustration surged through her. Why had she been left alone? Why had she been invisible when all she wanted was attention, comfort, and care? But slowly she realized that the answers were less important than what she would do next. She could not change the past, but she could shape the present and the future, for herself and for the baby who now depended on her. Leaving the meeting, she felt a mix of relief and sorrow. Relief because she had confronted a painful part of her past, and sorrow because of all the years lost to neglect and misunderstanding. But most importantly, she felt determination. She promised herself that she would not let this history repeat itself. She would ensure that the baby never experienced the emptiness, loneliness, or indifference that had marked her own early life. Every choice she made, every action she took would be guided by love, patience, and protection. Back at home, life continued, but now with a deeper understanding of herself and her purpose. Caring for the baby became not only a duty, but also a source of healing. She began to see the little signals more clearly, the way the baby's eyes lit up when she spoke, the tiny hands that reached for her, the comforting nuzzle when held close. Each moment reinforced their bond and reminded her of the transformative power of love. She realized that while she could not rewrite her own childhood, she could create a completely different world for this child, one filled with trust, warmth, and security. Challenges still came. There were nights when the baby cried endlessly, when exhaustion weighed heavily on her body and spirit, and when self-doubt crept in, whispering that she might not be enough. But she learned to breathe through the frustration, to listen to the baby's signals, and to trust her instincts. Slowly, she discovered that motherhood was not about perfection. It was about showing up consistently, responding with love, and being patient through the difficult moments. She began reaching out to others for guidance, something she had rarely done in her life. She joined small support groups for new caregivers, read about infant development, and asked questions without shame. Every conversation brought new insight, but she knew that no advice could replace the bond she shared with the baby. This connection was personal, intimate, and sacred. It was built on trust, care, and the quiet understanding that they belonged to each other. Small milestones became sources of quiet celebration. The first deliberate grasp of her finger, the first laugh, the way the baby seemed to recognize her face. Each moment was profound. She often found herself holding the baby and marveling at how much life and trust could be contained in such a small body. These moments reassured her that she was capable of giving love, of guiding this life, and of shaping a future very different from her own past. Even during times of frustration, spilled milk, sleepless nights, crying fits, she learned patience and humility. She discovered that love was not always easy, but it was always worth the effort. She reminded herself that the baby's trust was a precious gift, one that required dedication, attention, and care. And in those moments of quiet reflection, she felt her own heart healing, the old pain from her childhood softening as she poured herself into nurturing this tiny life. The young woman also began to think more intentionally about the future. She considered the baby's long-term needs, from health and nutrition to emotional support and stability. She imagined teaching the child to walk, to speak, to explore the world with confidence. Each thought carried responsibility, yes, but also hope. She realized that motherhood was not only about addressing immediate needs, but about creating a foundation for life, and she felt empowered by the knowledge that she could provide that foundation. As the weeks went on, their bond grew in ways that were almost magical. The baby began to recognize her voice, anticipate her presence, and respond with small gestures of affection. Every glance, every nuzzle, every tiny giggle strengthened the invisible thread that connected them. She learned to read the subtlest signals, a twitch of the lips, a shift in breathing, a focused gaze. Each moment was a dialogue, a silent exchange that communicated love, trust, and belonging without words. Her own transformation became apparent too. She noticed that patience, empathy, and resilience had become part of her daily life. She found herself approaching challenges outside the home with a steadier hand and a calmer mind. Caring for the baby had taught her to value consistency, understanding, and compassion, lessons that extended far beyond her role as a caregiver. She realized that nurturing another life had allowed her to grow in ways she had never imagined, and she welcomed the change. At night, when the baby finally fell asleep, she would sit quietly, reflecting on their journey. She thought about the chance encounter that had brought them together, the long days of feeding and soothing, the moments of doubt and triumph, She marveled at the transformation she had undergone, the depth of love she had discovered, and the courage she had found within herself. The past, with all its pain and neglect, no longer dictated her actions. She could face it, acknowledge it, and still choose love, care, and hope every single day. Even in the small routines of daily life, she saw progress. Playtime, bath time, feeding, and gentle rocking were no longer tasks but moments of connection. She learned to take joy in the simplest gestures, a giggle, a stretch, a curious look. Every day brought new discoveries, not just for the baby, but for her as well. She began to understand that motherhood was not simply about providing physical care. It was about nurturing trust, curiosity, and confidence in another human being. Through it all, she discovered that healing could happen in the most unexpected ways. By giving love, attention, and care to the baby, she was slowly mending the wounds of her own childhood. She realized that the child's dependence on her allowed her to cultivate empathy, patience, and understanding she had longed for herself. In nurturing the baby, she had found a path to her own emotional recovery, a path defined by presence, consistency, and unconditional love. The young woman began to see the future with hope rather than fear. She imagined the first steps the baby would take, the first words it would speak, the first experiences of the world outside their small apartment. Each thought inspired a sense of responsibility and purpose, but also joy. She understood that she could not control everything that would happen, but she could provide guidance, stability, and love, creating a safe and nurturing environment in which the child could thrive. And so, life continued. Each day brought challenges and rewards, moments of doubt and moments of triumph. She had faced her past, confronted the pain she had carried, and chosen a path of care and love. She had accepted that the past could not be changed, but she could shape the present and the future. Through it all, she and the baby grew together, each teaching the other about trust, patience, and the transformative power of love. As the sun set one evening, she held the baby close, marveling at the small face, the tiny hands, and the life she had vowed to protect. She felt gratitude for the journey they had shared, for the bond they had built, and for the chance to create a life that was different, full of care, hope, and love. She understood that motherhood was not about perfection or control. It was about showing up day after day with patience, dedication, and heart. And in doing so, she had not only transformed the life of this child, but had also discovered her own strength, resilience, and capacity to love in ways she had never imagined. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, painting the apartment in warm gold. The baby stirred, letting out a small yawn and stretching tiny arms upward. She watched with a gentle smile, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. The weeks and months they had shared had created a bond that felt unbreakable. Every challenge, every sleepless night, every worry had brought them closer, forging a connection built on trust, care, and an endless stream of quiet love. She carefully lifted the baby, cradling the small body against her chest. The soft coos and tiny sighs were like music, a rhythm she had grown to know as intimately as her own heartbeat. Feeding time had become more than a routine. It was a moment of connection, of reassurance, a time when the baby knew it was safe, loved, and cherished. She marveled at how much the child had grown, how alert and curious its eyes were, how tiny fingers now grasped her hand with purpose. Each day the baby learned, and with it, she learned too about patience, about love, and about the depths of her own heart. The apartment, once quiet and lonely, had transformed into a home filled with warmth, laughter, and soft sounds of discovery. Toys scattered across the floor, blankets neatly folded in corners, bottles lined up like little soldiers ready for battle. All of it reflected her commitment, her care, and her desire to provide a stable, loving environment. She realized that motherhood was not about perfection. It was about creating a safe space, nurturing growth, and showing up consistently no matter how tired or uncertain she felt. Days passed with a gentle rhythm. Morning walks became a cherished routine. The baby, now able to sit up and reach for objects, watched the world with wide-eyed wonder, exploring leaves, stones, and the small wonders of the city streets. She held its hand, guiding steps, pointing out colors, shapes, and sounds. The simplest things became lessons, each interaction a way to build understanding, trust, and confidence. And in these small moments she felt the joy of giving life something it had never known, a sense of safety, of love, of presence. Evenings were quieter but no less meaningful. Bath time became a playful ritual, filled with laughter, splashes, and gentle conversations. She marveled at how something as simple as warm water could bring joy and comfort, how the baby's tiny hands would reach out to touch her face, how eyes would brighten at familiar routines. These moments reminded her of the fragility and beauty of life, and of the importance of being present, of showing love through action, attention, and care. Challenges, of course, still came. There were days when the baby cried for no apparent reason, nights when exhaustion weighed heavily on her body and spirit. There were times when doubts crept in, questions about whether she was doing enough, whether she could provide the future the baby deserved. But she had learned to face these moments with patience, deep breaths, and quiet determination. Each time, she reminded herself that love was not measured by perfection but by persistence, presence, and the willingness to care even when it was hard. The baby's first words arrived unexpectedly one afternoon, a soft halting sound that resembled her own name. She froze, heart racing, tears welling up. The sound, small and tentative, was a declaration of trust, a recognition of her constant presence, and a milestone that marked the growth of both the child and herself. She repeated the words softly, encouragingly, and the baby responded, repeating them with increasing clarity. In that simple exchange, she realized the profound impact of her care, the tangible results of love, attention, and patience. As the weeks went by, the baby's curiosity expanded. It began exploring corners of the apartment, reaching for books, toys, and household objects. She watched closely, ready to intervene when needed, but also allowing the child to learn through experience. She marveled at how much growth could occur in such a short time, how a tiny life could be so resilient, eager, and full of wonder. And she felt immense pride, not just in the baby but in herself, for the patience, care, and love she had poured into nurturing this life. Friends and neighbors began to notice the transformation. They saw the young woman's dedication, the attentive care, and the love that radiated from every interaction. Some offered advice, some offered help, but all were touched by the bond they witnessed. She realized that while support from others was valuable, the true connection, the real work, and the deepest love existed between her and the baby. It was private, sacred, and unshakable. She also began to think more seriously about the baby's future. She imagined school days, first friends, small achievements, and big milestones. Each thought brought a mixture of joy and responsibility. She knew that she could not control everything the future held, but she could provide a foundation of love, security, and confidence. She planned carefully, saving what little money she could, learning new skills, and exploring opportunities that could give the child a stable life. Every step, no matter how small, was an investment in the life of someone who now depended entirely on her. Evenings were often moments of reflection. She would sit quietly while the baby slept, thinking about the journey that had brought them together. She remembered the fear, uncertainty, and struggle of those early days and compared them with the deep bond and sense of purpose she now felt. She realized that she had grown alongside the child, learning resilience, patience, empathy, and the power of unconditional love. The journey had not been easy, but it had been transformative. The bond between them deepened in subtle ways. The baby's laughter now followed her voice. Eyes would search for hers in a crowd, and small gestures of affection, a gentle touch, a hug, a tiny hand on her cheek, became constant reminders of the connection they shared. She discovered that love was not only about giving but also about receiving. She felt joy, pride, and comfort in these expressions of trust, and she learned to accept the love that was freely given in return. Challenges remained, particularly the moments when life demanded more than she had to give. There were times of illness, times of fatigue, and times of doubt, but she learned to navigate them with calm and determination. She realized that strength was not the absence of struggle, but the ability to act with love and patience despite it. Each challenge strengthened her bond with the baby, proving that care and commitment could overcome even the most difficult circumstances. Milestones continued to mark their journey. The first steps, the first attempts at words, the recognition of faces, and the joy of simple discoveries. All of these were celebrated with quiet smiles, soft praise, and endless encouragement. Each small achievement became a shared triumph, a marker of growth for both the baby and herself. She realized that motherhood was a journey of mutual learning, where both caregiver and child developed together, shaping one another in subtle and powerful ways. She also began to see the broader impact of her actions. By nurturing this child with love and consistency, she had created a ripple effect of positivity in her own life. She became more patient with others, more compassionate, and more willing to face challenges head-on. Caring for the baby had opened her heart, reshaped her priorities, and revealed the power of connection. She understood that the act of giving love could transform not only the recipient, but also the giver. As the days turned into months, a sense of stability settled over their lives. The apartment, once a place of quiet solitude, was now filled with laughter, exploration, and the warmth of a growing family. She knew that the path ahead would still hold challenges, but she no longer feared them. She had learned that love, patience, and dedication could overcome fear, uncertainty, and hardship. She felt confident in her ability to provide a life of safety, warmth, and joy for the baby she now considered her own. One quiet evening, as the baby slept in her arms, she reflected on how far they had come. From the first moment she had found the child crying and alone, to the present moment of peaceful security, they had grown together in trust, love, and understanding. She thought about her own past, the loneliness she had felt, and the absence of care, and she realized that the baby had given her the greatest gift of all, the chance to become the mother she had always longed for, the chance to experience love that was pure, reciprocal, and transformative. She knew that motherhood was not about perfection, accolades, or recognition. It was about presence, care, and commitment. It was about showing up every day, ready to provide comfort, guidance, and love. It was about learning, adapting, and growing alongside the child. And in this realization, she found peace, fulfillment, and a profound sense of purpose. She had discovered that love could heal wounds, build resilience, and create life in the truest sense. In the quiet moments, she often whispered promises to the baby, promises of protection, guidance, and unwavering love. She promised to be present, to nurture, and to guide through the small and large challenges of life. And in the warmth of these quiet moments, she felt a sense of completeness, as if the pieces of her own life that had been missing for so long were finally coming together. The days continued, each one bringing small discoveries, small joys, and moments of connection. She watched the baby grow, learn, and explore the world, and in doing so, she discovered her own growth as well. She became more patient, more empathetic, and more attuned to the rhythms of life. She realized that the love she had given was returned tenfold, not in material ways, but in trust, joy, and the quiet presence of a life she had nurtured. And so, she embraced motherhood fully. She accepted the responsibilities, the challenges, and the endless moments of care. She celebrated the milestones, both big and small, and cherished every laugh, every sigh, every small gesture of affection. She knew that the journey would continue to be filled with challenges, but she also knew that the bond she shared with the baby was strong enough to weather anything. She had found her purpose, her joy, and the life she had always dreamed of, not in spite of her past, but because of it.